A 19-year-old girl stood at the base of the deadliest mountain on Earth. Not because she dreamed of it, but because her mother needed the story. Sandra Weston had the money, the connections, and the absolute certainty that her daughter could do anything. And no guide, no weather report, and no warning sign was going to change that. But as Priya Weston took her first steps onto K2, one question hung in the cold air that every experienced climber at base camp was already asking. Did Sandra even understand what she had just sent her daughter into? When the official investigation finally closed 18 months later, Sandra Weston's name appeared on the final page of the report. Not in the section for grieving family members, not in the witness columns. Her name appeared in the respondent column of a formal negligence inquiry, listed alongside the budget expedition company she had hired and the lead guide who had stayed silent when he should have spoken. That is where this story ends. But to understand how a mother's ambition became a legal finding, you have to go back to a Tuesday morning in late June when Sandra sat across from a travel consultant in a glass-walled office in Chicago and said, without any hesitation, that she wanted her daughter on the summit of K2 by the end of August. The consultant paused. August, he explained carefully, was outside the standard K2 climbing window. The season ran from late June through mid-July when the jet stream lifted enough to allow passage through the upper mountain. By late August, the winds returned with real violence. Most serious expedition companies had already packed out. Sandra listened with the patient expression of a woman who had spent 20 years in corporate work and had heard every version of the word no dressed up as professional advice. She told him her daughter had a flight home on the first Monday of September. She asked him to find a company that could work with that. The company he found was called Summit Arc Expeditions, a Pakistani outfit operating out of Skardu. They were not the cheapest option, but they were far from the most reputable. They occupied that middle space in the commercial guiding industry, where corners get trimmed quietly, and the word of a well-paying foreign client carries more weight than the judgment of a local guide with 30 years on the mountain. Sandra wired the deposit of $47,000 within the week. The full payment of $94,000 followed 10 days later. Priya Weston was a pre-med student at the University of Michigan. She was 19 years old and had completed one Himalayan trek the previous spring, a guided walk to Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet that took 12 days and involved no technical climbing at all. She was fit, she ran 4 days a week, she had no fear of heights, but she had never worn crampons on a steep ice face. She had never clipped into a fixed line above 20,000 feet. She had never felt the death zone, where the air holds so little oxygen that your brain starts making decisions your body cannot survive. She found out about the expedition 3 weeks before departure, when Sandra placed a folder on the kitchen table and slid it across to her. Inside was a printed itinerary, a gear list, and a photo of K2's southeast ridge taken from base camp. Priya stared at the photo for a long time. She said she was not sure she was ready for something like this. Sandra told her she was more ready than she thought. Priya did not argue. She rarely did. A fellow student who had dinner with Priya the week before she left later told investigators she kept saying she just wanted her mom to be proud of her. She said it 3 or 4 times that night. She didn't say she was excited. She didn't say she was scared. She just kept saying that one thing. The team arrived at K2 Base Camp on August 3rd. The air smelled of glacial melt and cooking gas and a cold that had no warmth in it at all, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your chin, no matter how tight you seal it. Prayer flags in faded reds and yellows snapped in the wind above the cluster of tents. Only 2 other expedition teams were in camp. Both were preparing to leave. One of their lead guides, a German climber named Heinz Brauer, who had summited K2 twice, stopped at the Summit Art Camp on his way out and spoke briefly with lead guide Faisal Amin. Faisal later told investigators that Brauer had looked at the weather models on a laptop and said plainly that the jet stream was scheduled to drop back over the mountain within 10 to 14 days. Anyone above Camp 3 after August 17th would be taking a level of risk that no commercial client should carry. Faisal thanked him, who also looked at Sandra Weston sitting outside her tent in a brand new red down suit, filming a video for what appeared to be a social media account. Anand understood that the conversation he needed to have with her would be one of the hardest of his career. He put it off for 2 days. The acclimatization rotations began. Priya moved through them quietly. She struggled above 21,000 feet, moving slowly, her lips going pale at Camp 2. Faisal noted it in his log. He wrote the words, "Client pace below expected threshold," and underlined them. He did not show the log to Sandra. On August 12th, Sandra called him to her tent and spread the schedule across her sleeping mat. She pointed at the summit date, August 18th. She reminded him of the Monday flight. Faisal looked at the schedule and then looked at the door of the tent. He told her the weather window was uncertain. Sandra told him that was why they were paying for an expert. Priya appeared in his tent doorway an hour later. She asked quietly, so her mother would not hear, whether he thought she could make it. Faisal looked at the girl standing in front of him, 19 years old, thin from 3 weeks at altitude, hands slightly swollen from the cold. He told her that the mountain would decide. It was the truest thing he said to anyone that entire expedition. The summit push began at midnight on August 18th. The cold hit differently above Camp 3. Below that elevation, there was still something your body could negotiate with, could layer against and manage. Above 24,000 feet, the cold became something else entirely. It got inside your joints. It pressed against the back of your eyeballs. Priya climbed in silence behind Faisal and behind Sherpa Dawood Karim, assigned as her personal high-altitude guide, and she focused on the fixed rope in front of her and on each crampon placement on the black ice of the Abruzzi spur. By 4 a.m., they had reached 25,500 feet. Priya was moving slowly. Her oxygen regulator was set to 2 liters per minute, the standard flow for this section of the climb, but something was wrong. She was not feeling the relief that oxygen should have brought. Her head felt wrapped in thick cloth. She told Dawood she felt dizzy. He checked her mask, checked the connection, tapped the gauge. It read correctly. 40 minutes later, at roughly 25,900 feet, Priya stopped on the fixed line and stood completely still. Faisal checked the regulator himself. The gauge read normal. And what neither of them knew was that the valve inside the regulator was cracked at a hairline fracture that only showed itself under pressure at extreme altitude. The regulator was delivering about 60% of the listed flow. Priya had been climbing the upper mountain on less than half the oxygen she was supposed to be receiving. Faisal radioed base camp and reported the suspected problem. Base camp advised him to use the backup regulator in Dawood's pack. Dawood opened the pack and found it. The thread connector did not match Priya's oxygen system. It was the wrong fitting. It had been packed that way since Skardu. Dawood Karim told investigators later, "I held the 2 pieces in my hands and I knew before I even tried to connect them. Someone had packed the wrong unit and no one had checked. I radioed base and told them." The man on the radio was quiet for a long time. Above them, the summit was visible. Sandra was at Camp 3 waiting. Her last message to Faisal had said, "We paid for a summit, don't come back without one." Faisal made the decision to continue. He increased Priya's flow rate to try to make up for what the cracked valve was losing. He told her to move slowly and to tell him immediately if she felt more confused. Priya nodded. Her face behind the oxygen mask was the color of old wax. Then the weather changed all at once. The wind went from 15 kilometers per hour to 60 in under 4 minutes. The temperature dropped 9 degrees in the same window. A full whiteout arrived, complete and total, dropping visibility to less than 3 meters. Faisal called a retreat immediately. He turned Priya around and they started down. But Priya was already showing the early signs of brain swelling from the altitude. Hours of low oxygen, combined with the sudden shock of wind and cold, had pushed her brain past what her body could handle. She stopped responding to verbal directions. Her movements became uncoordinated. She stepped sideways off the route twice in 50 meters. At 6:44 a.m., the wind reached 90 kilometers per hour. A fixed line anchor above Camp 3 pulled loose from the ice, sending 3 meters of rope slack down the face. Priya stepped into that slack, lost her footing on a thin patch of ice coating the rock, and slid 4 meters down the face before catching a crampon tip on a rock outcrop and stopping. Faisal grabbed for her and held 2 seconds before the wind pulled her sideways. She was not seriously hurt, but the fall had completely disoriented her. She was sitting on the ice at 25,800 feet in a full whiteout and did not know which direction was down. Her pupils were unequal. The brain swelling was getting worse. Faisal's radio died at 7:03 a.m. The battery had been draining in the extreme cold all night. He wrestled with his pack for 90 seconds in the wind to reach his satellite communicator. He typed with numb, clumsy fingers. Client brain, swelling suspected. Regulator failure, descent underway. Need extraction at Camp 3 now. The reply came 4 minutes later. Weather grounding all aircraft. Ground team leaving Camp 2. Dawood was almost carrying Priya now. She had stopped walking under her own direction. Her legs moved, but not toward anything. He locked his arm through hers and moved downward by feel, counting anchor points to track elevation. The wind screamed. It was a high mechanical scream that you felt in your chest more than you heard with your ears, and it did not stop. At 7:51 a.m., Priya began to see things that were not there. She said her mother's name twice and then said something about a parking garage. She reached out and grabbed at the empty air beside her. Dawood held her tighter and kept moving. At 8:14 a.m., a chunk of ice the size of a dinner plate struck Faisal's shoulder and knocked him sideways. He caught the fixed line and held, but his left arm went numb and stayed numb. At 8:39 a.m., 80 meters above Camp 3, Priya lost consciousness. She sagged against Dawood's arm and her full weight came down on him at 25,600 feet in 90-kilometer winds. He sat down on the ice and pulled her into his lap and wrapped both arms around her and held her. He radioed base camp with one hand and said 4 words. "She is not responding." The line was silent for 3 seconds. Then a voice said, "We see you on GPS. Ground team is 30 minutes out. Hold your position." Dawood held his position. He looked out into the white and he could not see 10 feet in any direction, and the wind did not stop, and he held her and he waited. The ground team that left Camp 2 at 7:55 a.m. was 2 Sherpas, a rope bag, a foil emergency blanket, and a thermos of warm fluids. They had no spare oxygen because the remaining bottles were already committed to other clients at Camp 3. Their names were Rahim Akhtar and Syed Hussein. Rahim had summited K2 once before in 2019, on a clear July day with mild wind. What he was climbing through now was not that mountain. The fixed lines above Camp 2 were coated in a layer of built-up ice that turned the rope into something close to a frozen cable. Each clip of his ascender took twice the normal effort. His fingers, even inside double gloves, were going from painful to numb. They reached Dawood's position at 9:22 a.m. Dawood was still seated on the ice, Priya across his lap, his arms locked around her. The foil blanket he had put up was in shreds. The wind had torn it apart in the first 20 minutes. His voice, when Rahim reached him, was flat and steady. The voice of a man who had been forcing himself to function for too long and was nearly empty. Priya was alive. Rahim pressed 2 fingers against her neck and found a pulse that was slow and faint and uneven. Her skin was chalk white. Her lips were gray. The lashes above her closed eyes had a crust of ice on them. She was breathing, but each breath was shallow and had a wet, rattling sound to it. Rahim looked at Syed and said nothing. Syed nodded. Rahim told investigators later, "When I found her, her eyes were half open, but she was not seeing anything. I spoke to her. I said her name. I told her we were here and that help was coming. I held her hand because I did not know what else I could give her at that moment. Getting the emergency harness onto her took 11 minutes. Each buckle was a separate fight with fingers that could barely close. Faisal assisted from above, running the rope through a redirect anchor. They began lowering her down. It was not a carry or a drag, it was something in between. A slow, controlled movement, one anchor at a time, and it was very slow. At Camp 3, Sandra Weston was standing outside her tent when the team arrived. She saw her daughter being lowered on a rope and made a sound that Faisal, standing 10 meters away, told investigators he would not be able to forget. He held Sandra by both arms and told her they needed space to work and that Priya was alive. Sandra kept saying her daughter's name over and over. Faisal administered the emergency injection for brain swelling at 10:07 a.m. It was the correct treatment, but it was designed to slow the damage, not reverse what had already happened from 3 hours of low oxygen at extreme altitude. They put Priya in a sleeping bag, wrapped her in both thermal blankets, and connected her to the one remaining functioning oxygen bottle at 4 liters per minute. The oxygen reader clipped to her finger came back at 58%. A healthy person at sea level reads 95 to 100. She needed to get below 14,000 feet immediately. They were at 24,000 feet, and all helicopters were still grounded. Faisal radioed base camp at 10:23 a.m. He gave the oxygen reading and said that she could not walk down, that they needed a helicopter as soon as possible. Base camp said they were in contact with the Pakistan Army High Altitude Rescue Unit. The pilot on standby was Major Tariq Zaman, who had carried out 11 K2 rescues over 8 years. Base camp said the weather might open briefly around 2 p.m. At 11:40 a.m., Priya's eyes opened. She looked at the tent ceiling. She looked at Dawood's face. She said one word. She said, "Cold." Dawood told her she was okay. He told her they were getting her off the mountain. Her eyes closed again. The helicopter made its first attempt at 2:08 p.m. Major Zaman brought the aircraft up the glacier corridor toward Camp 3 and got within 400 meters before a wind gust pushed the rotors sideways. He aborted. He made a second attempt at 2:34 p.m. and got within 250 meters. The rescue basket was deployed and swinging below the aircraft. Then the cloud dropped again all at once and he pulled out a second time. The third attempt was aborted at 3:11 p.m. Zaman told the inquiry board, "I made 3 attempts. On the third one, the wind threw us hard enough that my co-pilot's shoulder hit the doorframe. I made the call to hold at base and wait. It was the right call. It was also the hardest call I have made on this mountain." Faisal watched the helicopter turn away the third time and went back to the tent. The oxygen reader now showed 51%. Her breathing had changed to a slow pattern of breaths that came in clusters and then stopped for a few terrible seconds before starting again. He had read about that pattern in a wilderness medicine course. It was one of the signs that a body was starting to shut down. He sent a message to base camp on the satellite communicator. "Client getting worse. Another hour at this elevation may not be survivable. Need any option. Anything." The reply came back 6 minutes later. "Weather opening at 1800 per latest model. Pilot standing by. Hold." Faisal put the communicator down. He looked at Priya's face. He looked at Sandra sitting in the corner of the tent with her knees pulled to her chest, eyes fixed on her daughter. Yet the woman who had wired $94,000 and dismissed 3 weather advisories and texted, "We paid for a summit," was absolutely silent. The next 12 hours would determine everything. The helicopter reached Camp 3 at 6:22 p.m. The weather window lasted 19 minutes. Major Zaman held the aircraft steady while the rescue basket was loaded, and Priya was secured inside with oxygen running and both thermal blankets wrapped around her. Dawood held her hand until the basket lifted off the ground. Sandra was not extracted with her. There was no room, and the weight limit allowed no compromise. She watched her daughter rise into the gray sky on a cable and disappear into the cloud. Priya arrived at the hospital in Skardu at 7:41 p.m. her body temperature was dangerously low. But her oxygen level on full supplemental flow was 62%. The brain swelling had gone too far for any single treatment to bring back. She was placed on a breathing machine and moved to the intensive care unit. She died at 4:17 a.m. on August 19th. The official cause of death was severe brain damage from altitude-related swelling, made worse by prolonged exposure to extreme cold and the failure of her heart to keep pace with the damage. She was 19 years old. The investigation took 14 months and produced 3 findings. First, Summit Arc Expeditions had knowingly accepted a client whose experience fell below the company's own minimum standard, approved by a written waiver from her mother. Second, the oxygen regulator assigned to Priya had been flagged as potentially defective during an equipment check on July 29th. The depot manager had written, "requires verification before high altitude use" in the maintenance log. Someone had crossed that out and written "serviceable" in different ink. The regulator had been issued to Priya 3 days later. The cost of a replacement unit was $412. Third, Sandra Weston was listed as a contributing party for instructing the guide company to proceed with the summit attempt on August 18th, after being told directly by Faisal Aman the evening before that conditions had moved past safe limits. He had finally told her. She had reminded him of the Monday flight. The case was filed in the Pakistan Alpine Safety Registry as a preventable fatality, resulting from equipment failure and deliberate deviation from safety protocols. This mirrors the pattern seen in the 1996 Everest disaster and the 2008 K2 tragedy, where ignored warnings and commercial pressure combined to take lives that did not need to be taken. Priya's phone was recovered from the tent at Camp 3. The screen was cracked. When investigators charged it, they found one unsent text in the drafts folder, addressed to her mother, written sometime the night before the summit push. It said 4 words. It said, "I'm scared, Mom, please." She never sent it. A mother forced her daughter to climb K2, and the mountain answered in the only way it knows how. The summit is still there. Priya is not.